Hello, and welcome to our Global Engagement Online Series, or GEOS, a program of the United Nations Association of the USA. My name is Rachel Bowen Pittman, and I'm the Executive Director of UNA USA. I'm delighted to be with you today to recognize World Refugee Day in collaboration with UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency. 5 years ago, when UNA USA launched its 3-year Adopt a Future campaign to support refugee education in UNHCR camps in Kakuma and Dadaab, Kenya, there were 65.6 million individuals forcibly displaced worldwide as a result of persecution, conflict, violence, or human rights violations. Of that amount, 22.5 million people were refugees. Today, according to the recently released 2020 Global Trends Report by UNHCR, there are nearly 82.4 million people forcibly displaced worldwide, which is a 20% increase since 2016. This enormous amount of an increase in such a short period tells us that our work in solving the refugee crisis is far from over, which is why we as UN advocates must take note and take action. In just a moment, we will be joined by my colleague, Michael Spangler, Director of Advocacy and Humanitarian Affairs at the Better World Campaign, who will moderate conversations with our guest speakers. Through their discussion, we will learn about the state of the global refugee crisis and UNHCR's life-saving work, as well as the trials and triumphs of refugees around the world and here in the United States. We will also hear from one of our very own UNA USA members on what we can do to support resettled refugees. If you have questions at any time, please type them into the Q&A box, which can be found at the bottom of your screen on your navigation bar. Selected questions will be read aloud to our guest speakers during the Q&A segment. Please note that the chat box will not be monitored, but you can access a link for speaker bios in the chat box. So let's get started with a brief video from UNHCR.
When the crisis raised, all my dreams has been destroyed.
Yo nunca pensé salir de mi país.
Ile yote ilituogopesha sana, na mpaka hivi tulikimbia mikono wazi.
Thank you for that, and thank you all for joining us, and appreciate the introduction, Rachel. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Micah Spangler. I'm Director of Advocacy and Humanitarian Affairs at the Better World Campaign, sister organization of UNA USA, and I'm privileged to be with you all here today. I think that was a very sobering video, but uplifting, and to commemorate World Refugee Day and to speak a little bit about the Global Trends Report that was just released. We were joined by a good friend and colleague of UNA, Jana Mason. Jana is a Senior External Relations Advisor for UNHCR here in Washington, D.C. Her full bio is in the chat, so please feel free to take a look at that. But we want to get right to questions for Jana. Jana, last Friday, UNHCR's Global Trends Report was released, as Rachel mentioned. This is a hotly anticipated annual report that you put together, and it revealed that despite the pandemic, the number of people fleeing wars, violence, persecution, and human rights violations has reached, sadly, an unprecedented level. We're hoping that you might be able to share with us just a few key takeaways from the report for the UNA members that are on the line with us today. Jana?
Well, thank you, Micah. And first of all, I want to say thank you to the UN Association for holding this event in recognition of World Refugee Day. It's particularly wonderful to be with Nga, who is so inspiring, and I know we'll all hear from her later, and Linda, who I had the good fortune of meeting a few times, including in Dallas, where I saw the work of the local chapter. So great to be with both of you. Micah, I think you just said in reference to the video that it was sobering but uplifting. And that's the way that we view World Refugee Day as a whole. It's sobering when you look at the numbers. And as you said, they're unprecedented, but it's uplifting because we use this occasion to celebrate the resilience of refugees and the contributions that they make to their new communities. So yeah, first of all, on the numbers, unprecedented level of global forced displacement. I think the video mentioned it, Rachel mentioned it, over 82 million, 82.4 million. If we unpack this a little bit, you can divide this into a few big categories. My agency is the UN Refugee Agency. Refugees are people who have crossed a border because of war, persecution, violence. That figure stands at roughly 26 million. Of those, over 20 million are handled by my agency, UNHCR. So you think Syrians, Afghans, South Sudanese, people from Myanmar. Another 5.7 million are Palestinians who are under the mandate of a sister UN agency called UNRWA. We have a special category that we've had for the past couple of years for Venezuelans displaced abroad, outside Venezuela. There are a couple reasons we distinguish, and part has to do with the nature of the conflict, the situation in Venezuela, why they're fleeing, but almost 4 million, 3.9 million Venezuelans displaced abroad. So if you add them to the refugee number, you have over 30 million people who have crossed a border, fled their home country, again, because of persecution, war, violence. A larger number are people who have fled their homes, but for various reasons, they haven't fled their countries. This is 43 million, and these are what we call internally displaced persons, IDPs. And then rounding out the number, you have a little over 4 million people who have filed individual asylum claims, often in countries like the US or Europe, countries with their own asylum system. That's a little over 4 million. So you add that all up and you get to the 82 million, which again is unprecedented. It's the highest figure on record. Now, if you've listened to other World Refugee Day events or heard me or any of my colleagues speak, we've said this every year for the past few years, the highest on record, the highest level since World War II. And that sort of gets us to one of the takeaways that you asked for. The first one is that persecution, war, violence continue unabated. Old crises continue, they don't get resolved, new crises pop up. When you think about the old crises, you think about Somalia, you think about Afghanistan, which is in the news again. You think about South Sudan. Now Syria, I remember when Syria was a new crisis, it seems like it wasn't that long ago, 2011, now it's an older crisis. Then you have the ones that are truly new in the past few years, the Ethiopia, the crisis in Tigray, parts of the Sahel, the central Sahel, unprecedented displacement there. Myanmar, Burma, both a new conflict and an older one. Venezuela, which I mentioned, new in the past few years, and closer to home, the north of Central America, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, even other parts of Central America, Nicaragua, and even Mexico, right in the US backyard, a source of growing displacement. So one takeaway, which I say every year, is that as an international community, we need to do a much better job resolving conflict. That just isn't happening. So when you have the old conflicts that don't go away and the new ones that start, that's how you get to this ever increasing number. 3/4 of refugees are in what we call protracted situations, which means a population of at least 25,000 who have been displaced in a certain location for 5 years or more. 5 years is on the low side. You have populations that have literally been displaced for decades, children born, raised, knowing nothing but refugee situation. So the first takeaway, conflict and war don't stop. But again, let's look at what happened last year. And you referenced the global pandemic. In a pandemic year, when the whole world was focused on responding to and eradicating COVID, you would have thought, we initially thought, maybe naively, that displacement would slow down, that maybe conflict would ease up for a while. That didn't happen. Despite the pandemic, conflict and persecution still happened. So we saw, for example, last year that we had new displacements of over 11 million. Over 8 million of them internally stayed in their country, well over 1 million still fled the country. So even a pandemic didn't stop conflict and displacement. But I will say that it could have been worse. It could have been much worse. An increase from last year's level of 79.5 to a little over 82 is probably far less than what we could have seen if not for COVID, because at the peak of the pandemic, we had over 160 countries that had closed their borders, and almost 100 of those made no exception for people who were seeking asylum. So we did have border closures, even at the height of the conflict and the pandemic. The numbers could have been worse. So that's another takeaway. But the final takeaway I would mention, and this is where we get to the hopeful, the uplifting part, is that we saw throughout the year that refugees and other forcibly displaced persons contributed greatly to the pandemic relief effort. They stepped up. Many of them were already healthcare professionals, doctors, nurses, technicians. Others in a volunteer basis stepped up to do their part, either in their home country or a neighboring country where they found themselves, or those who were resettled in places like the US contributed greatly to alleviating the suffering during COVID. So what we learned, which is something we always knew, but COVID really brought it home, is that inclusion is key. Inclusion of refugees and other displaced, not only in the national healthcare systems and vaccines, for example, because we know none of us are safe from COVID until everyone is safe. You know, the pandemic knows no borders, doesn't respect status or terminology. Everyone was at risk. So we need to include the displaced in vaccine efforts, in healthcare systems, wherever we find them. But what we've also learned in the past few years is that refugees and other displaced need to be included in education. They need to be included in the workforce, the labor force. While they're waiting for a solution to their plight, they need to make use of their time and their talents so that they can contribute. So I think, as Rachel said at the beginning, our work is far from over, but we really rely on UNA and all the local chapters and partners to help us do this important work. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Jana. I think we've got plenty of questions, and I've got many of my own, and we're going to get to those just towards the end of the program. But thank you for giving us that overview. And as I said, and I think you reiterated, sobering but uplifting. I've had a chance to see UNHCR's work up close in many different refugee settings and meet with refugees that have been uplifted and lives saved because of the good work that you and your colleagues do. So thank you for joining us, and we'll be getting to questions shortly. With that, I'd like to turn over to a good friend of UNA, Nga Vương-Sandoval, who is a Colorado delegate in the Refugee Congress. She had a very, very unique experience just a few weeks ago in her adopted home state that we're going to share with you just a little bit, and then we're going to have some questions.
One woman is sharing her story to help people understand why there's a refugee crisis, and she's pleading with First Lady Dr. Jill Biden to make changes for others in the same situation. Our Jacqueline Quinn sat down with her.
You are beautiful, resilient, estamos contigo, which is Spanish for we're in this together. Hopeful messages at this mural for a person that was once a boat refugee herself, and she's sharing her story so that people can understand why we still have a refugee crisis. Pho, a traditional Vietnamese soup made with bone broth.
One of the things that people don't realize about refugees and people who have been part of a diaspora are the delicious contributions that they bring with them.
It's why there are so many pho shops around Denver Metro. Some were started by Vietnamese refugees after the Vietnam War.
We didn't know. We were out in the open sea, not knowing where it would land, not knowing if anyone even knew we were out there.
Nga Vương-Sandoval was just 3 when her parents fled Vietnam on a boat, making their way to refugee camps before being welcomed into the U.S. Part of that is the story behind this photo with First Lady Jill Biden.
And it was unbelievable for me to realize and recognize the gravity of that moment of starting off as a little Vietnamese girl on a refugee camp, hoping that compassion and sympathy and empathy would be provided to us when we arrived.
Vương-Sandoval sits on a number of boards, including Lutheran Family Services Rocky Mountains, her goal to advocate and help refugees resettle.
Currently in the world, we have over 26 million refugees.
The U.S. has for years accepted about 125,000 refugees annually until the last administration, when the numbers slowly tapered to 15,000.
Through war, persecution, religious persecution, political persecution, violence.
Just some of the reasons that led people to being displaced, now waiting in a refugee camp for a country to accept them.
They're extremely vetted. It's through 3 different federal agencies.
The Biden administration has said it is working to admit more refugees, but some of the programs to help people transition have been impacted by the decline.
There are also opportunities to host people if that's something that you're comfortable with doing, or host events.
Vương-Sandoval's family, just one example of the struggle to find a better life.
Because you have to ask yourself, how would you want to be treated if you lose everything?
And there are millions of people like her waiting for an opportunity to find a new home. In Denver, I'm Jacqueline Quinn, CBSN, Denver.
Thank you for that. And Nga, good to see you. So glad that you're able to join us today. I guess I just want to get right to it. Let's start with that video. How amazing. How were you selected to meet Dr. Jill Biden? How did that come about?
So I want to thank everyone, first of all, our esteemed host and moderator, and I want to thank the United Nations Association, the UNHCR, and all of our attendees for joining us today. I'm truly honored to be part of this conversation. And Micah, thank you for that question. I appreciate that. So it was like I mentioned, the video was a surreal moment. I was contacted by the White House, who related to me that the First Lady wanted to invite me to meet her. And I didn't believe this was even a legitimate invitation when I received it. So I immediately did some fact checking, and turns out it was valid. And at that moment, I immediately knew that I wasn't going to just use this visit with Dr. Biden as just a photo opportunity. I knew that I wanted to bring the refugee crisis to light and to the attention of the First Lady. So following some security checks, and 24 hours later, I was on my way to meet Dr. Jill Biden. And when I arrived at our undisclosed location, I was met with several community leaders. There were only a handful of us that were invited. I could count on a hand and a half how many people were selected to meet Dr. Biden. And we each met with her individually. And when it was my turn, I introduced myself. I explained that I'm a Vietnamese refugee and that I advocated for refugees and immigrants and those who are seeking safety. I also reiterated that although the president's recent decision to raise the presidential determination to 62,500 is a start, it needs to be raised to the historic numbers of 125,000 or more. And I also reiterated and emphasized that we currently have over 26 million refugees worldwide. And welcoming refugees is something that has always been the hallmark of who we are as Americans. and that I urge the president to raise that ceiling, raise that number, because every single number that we're mentioning represents a human life.
Absolutely. And that is a core of, I think, what UNA has been advocating for a long time. And to have that opportunity to speak directly with Dr. Jill Biden, specifically on that refugee admissions cap, that must be amazing and such an empowering moment for your advocacy. I'd like to talk a little bit about, just going backwards, your background, your personal experience as a refugee, how it shaped your life, and the advocacy work that kind of brought you to that moment with Dr. Biden.
Thank you for that question, Micah. So my refugee story began after the Vietnam War and after the fall of Saigon. My family and I fled our homeland in an overcrowded cargo ship under extremely treacherous conditions. Many Vietnamese refugees during this time who were elderly, in poor health, or children did not survive this journey. And in fact, anywhere from 200 to 400,000 Vietnamese refugees died by sea at this time. So when we finally arrived on 2 different refugee camps, the final one was here in Arkansas in the United States. And we lived there in tents indefinitely until we were assigned to an American sponsor family. We stayed with our sponsor family temporarily and were forced to quickly learn English and acclimate to an entirely different culture, an entirely different country. But as I look back at my refugee experience as an adult, I know that the extreme adversity that we experienced and endured as refugees when we fled our homeland, in addition to the compassion and the assistance that was shown by others after we arrived to the US, it had profound impact on me. And these experiences shaped my understanding and compassion for refugees all over the world who are undergoing very similar or even worse situations right now. I use my personal experiences to shed light on the dangerous conditions that refugees continue to experience today. And I use these opportunities to amplify the international refugee crisis. I want to ensure that all refugees who are seeking safety are afforded the same opportunity that I was. And I had the opportunity to walk through the door and enter into the United States. Now I want to do everything I can to hold that door wide open for all refugees in order for them to walk through as well. I advocate because I know the extreme struggles of being a newcomer and a refugee, but I also advocate because countless people had advocated for me.
Right. I think that dovetails perfectly with the next thing I wanted to ask. I mean, I think without getting too political, we've seen over the last several years the refugee community being maligned, discriminated against at sort of unprecedented levels. You touched on it a little bit, but what do you want Americans to know now? What's something that we can take home to our family, to our communities, that we need to know about refugees and the refugee crisis that we're living through right now?
That's a great question, and it's a great segue to my response as well, is that I know there's a widely held misconception about how we're leaving less desirable countries. And I'm expressing this misnomer in a very PC fashion, because I know that the last administration was emblematic in categorizing our homelands in this derogatory way. We're fleeing less desirable conditions, war, persecution, religious persecution and conflict, situations that had we stayed there, we would have endured starvation, torture, death, or actually all the above. No one wants to leave their homeland. We were forced to flee, and we never wanted to leave everything that was familiar to us. The situation forced us to. We want to keep our heritage, traditions, culture, language, and foods. These are not aspects that we ever want to lose. But I also want to recognize that we also value learning English as a language, or whatever language it is that's spoken in a receiving country, because we see value in adapting to the US culture, because we recognize that language and culture are tools for us to thrive as part of our success. As a refugee, and with all refugees, we know firsthand the experiences of loss of homeland, loss of family, safety, and security. And these aspects drive us to succeed. Refugees flee because we have no peace in our homeland, because of the conflict, instability, civil and political unrest, and wars cause people like me and millions of others to flee our homeland. We need to learn about the root cause of why human beings are being displaced, instead of blaming refugees for fleeing life-threatening situations.
So well said. And that brings me to my very last question, then we'll open it up to our audience here. And if you do have a question, I know there's some popping up already, but please feel free to enter it into the chat and we'll get to that next. It kind of builds right into this I think this perfect last query is how can we, communities across the US build inclusive societies to help refugees thrive? And UNA, I think we're a very action results oriented organization. We don't just talk the talk, we like to walk the walk. And from your perspective and the work that you've been doing, how can communities go about building those inclusive societies that are needed for refugee communities to thrive and to adapt and become inclusive?
Thank you for that question, Micah. In my TEDx talk entitled Assimilation is Colonization, I distinguish very clearly the difference between the concepts of assimilation and integration. We as refugees want to integrate into our new communities, but we don't want to erase our identity and who we are. Don't ask us to change our birth names. Please honor that and honor and respect our names. It's one of the very, very few items that we were able to take with us when we fled our homeland. Don't discourage us from speaking our mother tongues and our native tongues, because guess what? We can do both. Refugee Congress delegates, because I'm the Refugee Congress delegate for Colorado, we originate from 26 different countries. And guess what? We all speak English plus our native language and oftentimes additional languages. And I'm proud to still remain fluent in my native Vietnamese as well. Another suggestion I would have, and I strongly encourage those who are non-refugees, is to try to understand the emotional, psychological, and physical trauma of losing everything. Be compassionate to the suffering of others. Be sympathetic and impart grace on how difficult it is to learn a new language and culture while mourning the loss of our family and homeland. I mean, I have people who can't pronounce my one syllable name, and yet they can't impart grace to someone because they're not able to speak English fluently or without an accent. But most importantly, I want for people to pause for a second and ask yourself, if it was your grandparents, your father, your mother, or you who had lost everything, and I don't just mean one thing. I don't mean the natural disasters that we see here in the United States, where it could have been a wildfire or it could have been a hurricane, where you did lose your home, but you still get to remain in your homeland. You still get to speak the language and communicate with the people around you. You have to ask yourself, if you, your family member or loved one has lost absolutely everything, how do you want to be treated? How do you want to be welcomed? That's something I think needs to be on the forefront when we're talking about welcoming others and ensuring that we are inclusive, not just individually, but as a collective society.
So well said. Someone put in the chat, I think something, a quote that you just said is, be compassionate and impart grace. And I think that's just beautifully said and would fit beautifully on a bumper sticker. So maybe we can get those in the UNA shop. We've got a couple questions and I'll bring Jana back in here. First one, I think this is really kind of hits the nail on the head is, Jana, from your perspective at UNHCR, and of course you're part of the larger UN system that's working on this really big problem, but as we have hopefully decreasing vaccine hesitancy in the US, how can we continue to advocate towards global accessibility for COVID-19 vaccinations? How are we and perhaps UNHCR working to empower countries and local communities to receive vaccine doses and perhaps limit or reduce their own vaccine hesitancy.
Absolutely. And I will say, starting with the last part of your question, I haven't seen too much vaccine hesitancy in many parts of the world. We know it's an issue here. It's a very confounding issue and troubling. Globally, there are countries, individuals who are desperate to get the vaccine. And we're, as a part of the UN, as you mentioned, we're happy to participate in the COVAX initiative and work with UN partners such as the World Health Organization to try to get vaccines to as many people around the world as possible, including the forcibly displaced. UNHCR as an agency doesn't directly procure or deliver the vaccines, but we consider ourselves part of what we call the last mile in delivery, given that refugees and displaced are often in remote or rather inhospitable areas of countries, often in the developing world. We partner with agencies to get the vaccine to them, and we advocate for all governments around the world to have access to this life-saving measure. So and to make refugees a part of that inclusion effort that I spoke about earlier. So yes, we're happy to be a part of the COVAX initiative and global efforts to get vaccine to everyone.
Thank you. And of course, the great news that came out just a few weeks ago, or just even less than a few weeks ago, that the Biden administration was donating 500 million doses, a majority of them through COVAX, is amazing, amazing news. And it will be amazing to see. Even part of that, I think, was that there was donations going to even UN frontline workers that are working in some really hostile, really tough circumstances. So I think that was very well welcomed. Pedro has a question, kind of a difficult one, but I think it could open up to either of you. It kind of hits on this nail of this issue of refugees participating in the governance of the countries where they flee, and if that is even a possibility of happening. So it's, how do you engage former refugees to participate in the governance of the countries they fled? And is that potential perhaps thwarted by autocratic or threatening leadership? Basically, how do refugees that have fled their homes get back involved in the communities that they were forced to flee? I don't know if either of you maybe have a comment on that.
If you don't mind, I'd like to answer that question, Micah.
Yes,
Jana, if that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
So for my personal experience, I never want to place a person into a situation that can be threatening to their own safety or the safety of their families. And with such instability in our homelands and with government corruptions that are going on throughout the world, again, I don't want to put someone in a compromising situation that would endanger them. So for myself, I serve with Christina Noble Children's Foundation, which is a nonprofit that is, the home office is here in the US, but the offices that serve are directly in Vietnam and Mongolia. And they are assisting families and children who are still impacted by Agent Orange, which is a little unfathomable for people to recognize that even decades later, people are still impacted by profoundly affected by the war in this way. And the way that I do that is to shed light on how this has continued to impact families, disastrously impacted for generations, because Agent Orange is still in the ecosystem. By creating that awareness and being able to put a face to what is going on with the current situation, I found that, one, people are astounded that the impact still lingers to this day. Two, that there's ways that they can help. I had the honor of visiting the children's centers in my homeland to meet the children. And there was a situation that I will never forget. There's a nursery that houses newborns and infants. And I was able to enter into this room, and our tour person, who was the director of that center, said, "Did you notice something interesting when you walked into this room? There's no crying." And that's something that you would expect in a nursery. And he said, it's because cognitively, they just don't react to this, have this sensory reaction in order to engage with people because of the physiological and psychological damage that has happened. And as I approached closer to one of the cribs, I held this little girl, and I asked how old she was. She looked like she was about 11 months old, 10 months old. Much to my surprise, she was 4 years old. The devastating effects that can happen that are not being discussed. So I think in that way, you can educate, you can show the implications, whether indirectly or directly, that's still affecting civilians who never chose to be in this situation, and perhaps bring some compassion for those who weren't able to flee the way I was, the situation I was in. And therefore, I think that might be one approach in order to build relationships and for others to see the value in human life. And I think it's a first step toward working to humanize who we are and the people, again, who weren't as fortunate, if you want to even phrase it in that way, because our journey was nowhere near anything that was peaceful or safe. But I think in order to bring these stories to light, we need to show the humanity and the compassion in order for others to realize and recognize that they can make a difference. And again, build the relationships that's needed in our countries that we fled.
Absolutely. Thank you. Jana, I think I've got a question that you might be able to ask. We've actually got a couple questions about DR Congo, but one of them, we mentioned, there's many, many reasons that people flee their homes: violence, persecution, conflict, of course, but one that is perhaps even more common is just natural disaster. And I'm sure there was a tragic volcano eruption in Goma not too long ago. I think something like 400,000 people were forced to flee. And our UNA Kentucky chapter was working on a project there, a water project there with Mercy Corps. And so they were just curious about the status, if you might have heard something about UNHCR's operations in and around Goma, and perhaps just the latest on that.
Absolutely. The DRC is one of those tragic situations where it's been going on far too long, and continues to produce displaced persons as a result of violence, as well as some of the situations that you just mentioned. The last time I checked the figures, and I haven't seen our new ones, but it's probably close to 1 million forcibly uprooted refugees, that is, across the borders of the DRC in Uganda and Burundi and Tanzania, Rwanda, elsewhere. So it's a large refugee population as well as a large IDP population. Natural disasters and climate events of the type that you've noted only make it worse. Now, I mentioned earlier that most refugees are those who are in protracted situations are largely in neighboring countries. Most of the world's refugees, despite what the media might have us believe, are in developing countries. They're hosted in developing countries who tend to be most at risk for natural disasters and even slow onset climate change. So even if people displaced purely as a result of climate events aren't refugees per se under international law, many of them suffer the type of situations that cause them to be refugees because drought and other climate change events cause scarcity of resources. Scarcity of resources often leads to conflict, which often has a persecutory element. So this is just a way to say there's a lot of overlap between climate displacement and refugees. Some of those who you would think are only displaced by climate, if you look carefully, if you scratch the surface, there's a clear refugee element to it. And then even when people are displaced, they're in parts of the world like the DRC that are more subject to climate change and climate events. So yes, my colleagues have been on the ground in the DRC and the neighboring countries for many years, responding to displacement there and in other places where a natural disaster hits. We work with other partners, it's not just us, we work with other UN agencies, NGOs, governments to respond to the climate event as well. But it's something that's not going to go away because, again, most refugees are in parts of the world that are so positioned to be hit the hardest as a result of climate shocks, natural disasters. So this is one of the issues of our time that we're working to try to address more systematically and more predictably.
Thank you for that. And now we have a question for you from Evelyn. I hope I'm pronouncing that right, from Evelyn Pace. And they were curious about the Refugee Congress and how does it work? Does each US state have a representative? And just a little bit of background on that.
I appreciate that. And Jana, I just want to thank you for the extraordinary work that UNHCR does. I was personally impacted by UNHCR because your organization helped resettle my family. So it's extremely meaningful to have you on today. And I want to thank you and your entire team for doing the difficult work on site as well as here in the US. Thank you so much. So as far as Refugee Congress, thank you so much for that question. We are the only nonprofit organization in the nation that is ran and led by refugees, former refugees, SIV, and immigrants. And we do have a delegate in each state. We also have honorary delegates as well. So all the work that you had seen just in that short clip, there's 49, or actually there are 59 others just like me in other states who are doing the work to advocate, lobby, and ensuring that the issues are brought to the forefront. And it's something that we think of in every level, whether on the in our respective states, in the local level, state level, federal level, but our engagement spans the entire nation and sometimes even overseas. And really, it's to have people more engaged and understand what it is to, one, be a refugee, the current situation, the past situation, and things that it can do to assist in meaningful ways, in ways that they're able to engage in, but to also keep folks apprised of the different layers and the multifaceted issues that impact refugees, immigrants, SIV, internally displaced people like Jana had mentioned. Because quite honestly, I think an important factor that I want to include into this is that when you become a refugee or an immigrant or fleeing from your country, you automatically are put into a very vulnerable situation the minute that you leave. So you are already in a situation where you're more prone to crimes being committed against you personally, whether human trafficking, slavery, indentured servitude. You're already going to significantly, tenfold, put yourself in a situation where absolute harm and real harm can be inflicted upon you. So those are the kinds of issues that we want to bring forward, in addition to the other communities that are rarely spoken about, LGBTQIA refugees, who are not only ostracized from their homeland, but oftentimes from their own families because of religious beliefs, family dynamics, or what have you. So we want to play a role in being a resource, but also being the voice, representation, and being out there and visible so people do not forget about this international crisis. But it's such a special and unique situation that we have. And I'm just so proud of all of our delegates, as well as the work that we do. And please visit our website. Please do to see all the stories and all the wonderful things that we've been doing and to stay apprised of these issues. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we probably have time for one more question, and I will turn that over to Jana. It's kind of a big one, so I don't know if you can answer it all in just 2 or 3 minutes. But a question from Dr. Sterling Carter: what role does the UN Security Council play in protecting the displaced, or proactively working with member states to prevent displacement? And can the UN Human Rights Council and/or the Security Council worked together to address displacement?
Absolutely. And that goes a little bit to what I said in my opening comments, where I talked about how the international community as a whole, which includes the UN, which I am a part of, hasn't done a good job of predicting conflict, preventing conflict, which would be even better. Prevention, would be the key. And then when it does happen, resolving it in a timely manner to minimize displacement, minimize death. even though my agency, UNHCR, is purely a humanitarian agency, non-political, obviously we are part of the larger UN, which includes the Security Council. But let's look at what the Security Council is. Let's look at what the UN is. The UN is basically a trade association. It's a membership association like UNA. It's a membership association of governments. And the Security Council is a small group of those governments who come together to make decisions. As many of you are aware, it's a very complicated situation. Certain members of the Security Council hold vetoes that often blocks meaningful reform, meaningful action. But the UN as a whole, as an entity, even though it's charged with keeping the peace globally, among other things, is only as strong as the countries who are its members. So as long as there continues to be disagreement, power dynamics, power competition, authoritarianism, which was mentioned earlier, as long as that continues, the UN is going to be limited in what it can do, because as any membership association, it has to represent all of its members. So the place to put efforts there is not only with the UN, write letters and get involved and advocate with the UN, but also advocate with governments. And you don't have to get too political in this advocacy. What it means is letting governments know that there is a constituency out there that cares about refugees, that cares about the displaced, and that wants your government, whichever country you're in, to be a leader in humanitarian response and human rights protection. So that will go a long way, I think, eventually to bringing the peace and preventing forcibly displaced persons from even existing.
Perfect, thank you. And actually, I think we'll have an advocacy moment towards the end where we can do just that. It wouldn't be a UNA USA event without that. But thank you, Jana. Thank you. Now, I hope I didn't mispronounce your name too many times. Apologies if I did, sincere apologies. But now I'd like to turn it over to a good friend of ours, Linda Abramson-Evans. Linda is a refugee community volunteer. Her bio will be in the chat there, and she is a member of the UNA USA Dallas chapter. Linda, over to you. Oh, Linda, you're still on mute.
Sorry, after teaching for 1.5 years on Zoom, you would think I would see that little microphone.
You're all good.
Thank you, Micah and Rachel and everyone attending, such as Evelyn Pace from our Dallas chapter. So she and others have been very active in the former Adopt a Future campaign and various other projects. And I also appreciate Jana's updates and Na's extraordinary story. In fact, it was a Vietnamese friend who introduced me to the refugee community and inspired me to do the volunteer work that I've enjoyed for these past years. So I'm happy to share a little bit about volunteerism here in the Dallas area, where refugees have been resettling since the 1970s. And I hope this may generate ideas for other UNA chapters and individuals to get involved. I'm also sure that some of you already are involved with refugee advocacy in your communities and could probably share advice and resources just as well. And some who are newer to this topic may have questions that we definitely won't have time to answer in this brief informative session. But my email address is in the volunteer guide and directory to refugee services in Dallas-Fort Worth that Rachel has shared in the chat, and I would be glad to connect later. So the first step is find out which agencies are resettling agencies in your area and then what their current needs are. Here, the resettlement agencies are International Rescue Committee, Refugee Services of Texas, Catholic Charities, and World Relief. And then additional organizations assist asylum seekers, survivors of human trafficking, and provide various community services. So you can search online to find similar agencies locally, and then check their websites for the contacts, the current needs, and volunteer training that is usually required. So I should mention that due to the slashes in resettlement these past few years and then the pandemic limiting interpersonal interaction, it has really been a challenge for agencies to maintain all the usual services and for volunteers to participate. But now that the cap for the US refugee admissions program has been raised a bit closer to the norm and people are getting vaccinated, the opportunities to help are opening up again. So what can you do specifically? These are a few examples of helpful volunteer activities. You can prepare welcome kits and help set up apartments, meet new arrivals at the airport and take them to their apartments. Now, usually caseworkers and volunteer coordinators will provide guidance on those sorts of actions. You can simply be a friend and a mentor, helping newcomers to navigate the culture and language, provide transportation and support for errands such as shopping, job interviews, doctor appointments. You might be able to offer fundraising and grant writing skills, or just networking to help find additional volunteers and resources, which is what our volunteer guide does. And you're welcome to use something like that as a model in your communities if you don't already have one. It's possible that a similar resource guide does exist. You might pick up and deliver donated items or donate resources yourself, such as furniture, appliances, personal care items, books, school supplies, toys, all of these. And money is always appreciated as well. And if you have a professional skill to offer, dentists, physicians, counselors, interpreters, and translators are always in demand. The UNA chapters can also help to promote and participate in events such as World Refugee Day, International Women's Day, and other programs and celebrations. In Dallas, these are often organized collaboratively by the refugee resettlement agencies for their clients, and they also often invite the public to join in and meet people and potentially become volunteers. UNA chapters can also hold programs to educate and inspire their members and invite refugees and service providers to speak and even join the chapter, which was the case for many years when I was serving on our board. I think it's important to emphasize that while refugees receive a few months of initial assistance, they are not a drain on the economy as skeptics might claim, and in fact, they contribute tremendously to the economy and the community. Some new arrivals may have a more difficult adjustment depending on the level of trauma that they've endured, but then most become self-sufficient as quickly as possible and are great neighbors and friends. And they just enrich the communities where they settle, in my opinion, in my experience. So refugees are advancing their education, they're working, starting businesses. Their contributions and success stories are as inspirational as it gets for me. So thank you for your interest, and let's make every day World Refugee Day.
Linda, thank you so much for sharing your experience and for providing us with a wealth of volunteer ideas on how we can support resettled refugees. I would also like to thank our colleagues at UNHCR for helping to organize today's program. And of course, thank you to Micah and Nga and Jana for your discussion, which I hope encourages all of us to increase awareness about the refugee crisis and the benefits of welcoming refugees in our communities. And before we close today, I would like to share with everyone 2 ways to take action and support the work of UNHCR. This year, for the World Refugee Day, UNHCR's campaign, Together We Heal, Learn, and Shine, encourages the public to support refugees through health, education, and sports. And health, by expanding refugees' access to primary and secondary health care, sexual and reproductive health, nutrition, and mental health services. In education, by transforming the lives of talented young refugees by donating towards their university scholarships. In sports, by getting involved in the hashtag Dream Ball Design Contest. Winners' artwork will be made into soccer balls sold to support refugees. You can also follow and cheer on this year's Refugee Olympic team in Tokyo. So visit the World Refugee Day website to learn more about how you can get involved, and we'll put the link to this site in our chat box. And of course, if you've been inspired by today's discussion about refugees and believe that seeking asylum is a fundamental human right, please text UNHCR to 30644 right now. You will be prompted to fill out a petition that will be sent to your member of Congress to let them know that you support UNHCR's work on the front lines responding to the refugee crisis around the world. And finally, there are many more ways that you can take action as a member of UNA USA. When you join UNA USA, you are joining 20,000 other Americans around the country who know the importance of the UN. At UNA USA, we are united in our commitment to global engagement and our belief that each of us can play a part in advancing the UN's mission and achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. To join our movement as a UN advocate, visit us at unausa.org. Thank you once again to our incredible speakers. And finally, a big thank you to everyone for joining us today. I hope you stay well and stay safe. Take care.